Good afternoon, everybody. So I've got the graveyard shift, which is possibly the worst shift ever to have on the second day of a conference. So while we always like to keep questions for the end, please, if you want to keep it interactive, stop me, ask me questions. Let's make it relevant and exciting. And if I see you sleeping, I will pick on you and ask you questions. So, okay. So I see that my fonts have changed, so if some of my stuff comes out a bit funny, it was when I emailed it. Okay, we're going to talk about fraud risk management today, but I want to set the scene a little bit. Why do we need fraud risk management? And it all dovetails eventually as to why do we need risk management, what's the point of it. And I'll bring in some very interesting topics or points that were made last night in the opening addresses and the opening panel discussions that we had last night. So PwC conducts a global economic crime survey on every second year. And we've just released our new stats on what are our findings about economic crime globally. So globally, we surveyed 6,337 institutions, both public sector and private sector. In South Africa, there was 232, again, both public sector and private sector. And I'm going to share with you some of the findings. It is the largest global economic crime survey that is conducted by any organization. This is a shocking statistic. Globally, if we look at it over here, South Africa, 69% of all organizations that we surveyed had experienced economic crime in the 12 months preceding our survey. Clearly, the front runners, as the global average, sits at 36%. So if I were to divide this room, everybody on this side of the room, your organizations have experienced economic crime in the last 12 months. That's a shocking statistic if we think about what that equates to financially. And I'm going to show you what the finances or the collateral damage of fraud is. So the types of economic crime experienced, and I want you to just focus on the top four. Asset misappropriation, that's theft of assets, abuse of resources, and this is across the industries. It was 68% in 2016. Previously, 2014 was 77%. Procurement fraud. In 2016, 59% of all economic crime experienced was procurement fraud. We are very susceptible, especially in an emerging market like South Africa. This is where we'd be spending a lot of money on development. Procurement fraud at 59% is shocking. Bribery and corruption, 52%. 52% of all organizations experience bribery and corruption. They were asked to pay bribes in order to secure tenders. They were asked to pay bribes in order to secure payment for work delivered. But our fourth fastest emerging crime, and I'm so glad that Benjamin touched on this and spoke about it, is cybercrime. We are not yet. The fourth fastest emerging crime globally is cybercrime. It will be very interesting to see in 2 years' time. It will probably be number 3 or number 2. We are not ready for cybercrime. We don't understand the full impact of cybercrime. Now, this is our global statistic, or South African statistics. We've got human resources fraud, accounting fraud, money laundering fraud, tax fraud, insider trading. But what I want to do now is bring it home a little bit. Institutional risks. These are risks that higher education institutions face, specifically universities. This is evidence that I gathered from my work at UNISA, but at the University of Pretoria, the University of Johannesburg. Fraudulent, irregular claim submissions. That's claims by our educators. Theft, mismanagement, and misuse of resources. Let me take it back aside. Asset misappropriation. The number one economic crime, asset misappropriation, comes out at number 2 in the institutions. See, the relevance of it is that we are losing resources through theft, abuse, and misappropriation. And that includes the abuse of our IT resources. Again, something that Benjamin touched on, that we're losing resources due to theft. Deliberate misinformation and miscommunication to students. A very interesting point that came through last night when Dr. Pauser spoke about fees must fall, hashtag fees must fall. And the misinformation to students. Yes, we won't increase your fees, etc., etc. But the Department of Higher Education and Training, as Professor van der Nest said, has limited resources. Where is the money going to come from? And it's so funny that this risk tracked at number 3 on a fraud risk register in a higher learning and education institution 2 years before the Fees Must Fall campaign started. The point that I'm trying to make is, what did the institution do about the risk? To number 3 risk, was it just a compliance exercise? And what I'm trying to get to is that we need to move away from risk being just a compliance exercise to embedding it as a culture. Manipulation of system data. 2 years ago, that comes out as your number 4 risk. Again, it's coming back to our cybercrime risks. Are we tracking from 2014 to where it's now the number 4 risk, emerging risk, cybercrime? Asset fraud, irregular HR, recruitment and appointment processes. Again, it comes out as our 5th largest economic crime. Plagiarism, conflicts of interest, abuse of leave. Prof. Kutsia said last night that universities exist for specific objectives. Yes, we've got all these 5 pillars and we're all fancy and all of that. But number 1 is that we have an increasing number of students graduating with credible qualifications. Number 1. Because as an employer, I'm not going to employ somebody who comes from an unknown university that I don't know those qualifications. They're not credible. And number 2, institutions exist for quality research, the quality of the research. So if you're tracking your number 8 fraud risk is plagiarism, that speaks directly to the risk threatening your strategic objective of quality research. So again, what are we doing with these risks? It's tracking on your top 10, relevant to the institutions. Number 5, assessment fraud, and that's us assessing our students. That talks directly to the institution's strategic objective of more students, credible qualifications. If your institution comes with a reputation or an incident of assessment fraud, what is the impact on the strategic objective of qualifying more students with credible qualifications? Ladies and gentlemen, we know about our fraud risks. They're there. We see it. We know how it impacts on our strategic objectives, but what are we doing about it? Professor Dion Rousseau made it very clear last night that in King 2, we must get away from the idea that risk is negative. Unfortunately, fraud risk is always negative. We must move away from looking at risk in a silo. I can stand here today and I can speak to you purely about fraud, asset misappropriation, theft, etc. But then I won't link to Benjamin's presentation about cybercrime because I'm focusing on my silo. He spoke about risk linking to strategy and performance of the organization. Strategy. We want to have more students with credible qualifications and we want to be known for our research. But if risk number 5, our assessment fraud, and risk number 8 hits the institution, what is that going to do to our strategic objectives? So what are we doing to manage that risk? So, detection of economic crime, and I really do apologize for it. I think when it emailed, it came through very funny. Now, this is your strongest case for why you need to do fraud risk management in your organization. Corporate controls, there are 3 categories here. We have corporate controls, we have corporate culture, and we have beyond management influence. This is how fraud was detected in the organization. Corporate controls, it's those things that me as management put in place to detect fraud. Corporate culture, it's the culture of the organization, to encourage whistleblowing, etc., and beyond the control of management. By far, the mechanism that detects more fraud that we found is fraud risk management at 17%. all fraud was detected, 17% of all fraud detected was detected through fraud risk management, by proactively identifying where our fraud risks reside and then putting in place detection programs. So that goes hand in hand with suspicious transaction reporting. So if there's anything that management can do that is within their ability to detect fraud, is firstly fraud risk management. Let's identify where we have the potential or where we are exposed to fraud. Then let's look at our controls around those risk areas, and then let's do fraud detection reviews. Some of the shocking ones for me is 14% of economic crime was detected by accident. Someone went on leave one day and someone was acting in their position, and that's how fraud was detected. 14%, that's a shocking statistic. It demonstrates that we do not have a handle on our fraud. We don't. We don't know what we don't know. Whistleblowing is becoming less and less effective because of fear of victimization and harassment, etc., etc. It's becoming less effective. So even if our corporate culture is that we encourage whistleblowing, we're not protecting our whistleblowers. And year on year, we're seeing that less fraud is detected through whistleblowing. Data analytics, 10%. Again, using our data, our fraud detection reviews, using our data is detecting 10% of all our economic crimes, those red flags. You know, it was very funny. I was reflecting a lot on the discussions we had last night and how we have the silo mentality. But if we consider things like, have we ever tracked in finance how many students have defaulted on their accounts as it increased? What's our recovery of student fees, etc.? And have we somehow mapped or seen the correlation to the Fees Must Fall campaign? Have we taken into account the economic environment, and have we done a risk analysis around that? And most of the time we haven't, because we operate in silos. This is finance, this is students, this is this. There's no connection. So today, more than ever before, a passive approach to detecting and preventing economic crime is a recipe for disaster, waiting for the fraud to happen. So we sit back and we wait. And it's a grudge purchase. I tell you now, being in forensics, if I get a call to do an investigation, it's because something has gone wrong already. It's too late. The horse has bolted. Being proactive about managing it is that we can stop those economic crimes from happening. So the financial impact of economic crime. 2% of our respondents surveyed said that their economic crime in the last 12 months cost them $100 million or more. 10% said more than 5 but less than $100 million. 13% said between 1 and 5 million US dollars. 19% said 100,000 to $1 million. So let me contextualize that for you again. Department of Higher Education and Training says they have limited resources. Correct? Limited resources, but some of that 5 million to 100 million US dollars is being lost to fraud. Can you imagine if we weren't losing this quantum of money to fraud? We would be able to provide free education. We would be able to invest into our education sector. So if we think about the impact of fraud is not just as an organization and an institution. Firstly, reputationally we've been impacted upon. Secondly, we've lost morale of the staff. But thirdly, and most importantly, we are not able to fund Fees Must Fall because we've lost so much money to fraud and corruption within the industry. This is a pervasive crime. This is something that we have to sit up, we have to take note of, and we have to be serious about. So in so saying, that was the scary statistics about fraud and what it does and why we need to undertake fraud risk management. What I want to do is just have a look at quickly the concept of fraud and corruption risk assessment. So in order to understand what we mean by fraud, and it's a lovely buzzword, we see it all the time, what is fraud, etc. We use this term. In order for us to fully appreciate and conceptualize our fraud risks, we need to have a common understanding of what we mean by fraud. So we look at fraud, the general definitions, and this is I can share this with you because it's a public document. This is the definition that you'll find in many universities' anti-fraud strategies and plans, because this would have been the definition that I use. So we look at fraud, the legal definition. Firstly, it's unlawful. So there's unlawfulness. We're not going to comply with the policy. We're not going to comply with the law, etc. Intent. So we do it on purpose. When we have intent, we have thought about it and we are going to do it on purpose. Making of a misrepresentation, a lie. We don't tell the truth. Resulting in actual or potential prejudice. Very important. You don't have to have lost something. You could potentially have lost something. So very often what happens is somebody provides a fraudulent claim. But the manager's sharp and the manager picks it up and the claim is just declined, and that's where the matter ends. Potentially, the organization could have lost that money. It was as Benjamin's story that he was relating about, where the student was stopped when he was changing his marks. Potentially, the university could have been impacted. But what do? We don't take corrective action. We just leave it. And we change all the rules. It was as Professor Kutsia was saying last night, and then we become over-regulated. Because one person does something, we don't take corrective action against that person, we just change all the rules. So we need to be aware of the potential prejudice. And prejudice, again, is bias, loss of reputation, employee morale. Financial prejudice is easy, we lost money. It's the non-financial prejudice that we don't quantify that has far-reaching effects. I can tell you 100,000 Rand was stolen. I can't quantify what it did to the reputation of the organization. And let's be honest and realistic with each other. And I often ask people this question: do you think public sector or private sector is more corrupt? Private sector, you see, I'm getting a private sector, The idea that public sector is more corrupt is based on the fact that there is more media attention on the public sector. Because it's public institutions, it's public money. That's why. There's just as much corruption in the private sector. Let's not be fooled by this. But the fact is, the prejudice, the reputational damage that fraud and corruption does in the organization's reputation is clearly visible in our perception of our public sector. It's clearly visible. And that's what we always need to bear in mind, that when these things happen, the first thing that's impacted upon is the reputation of the organization. Then we also look at theft. Again, theft, intent, unlawful, misappropriation of another person's property, depriving them of that right. Stealing. We steal things. Now, it's not just stealing tangible things. It's stealing of time. It's stealing of, and those things all have an impact on your reputation, your financial status, etc. We also then consider conflicts of interest and other unacceptable conduct. Now, what's conflict of interest? It's when I have a specific interest in a tender, etc. I'm conflicted. There's a conflict of interest. Acquisition in private investments, unacceptable conduct relating to witnesses, threatening of witnesses, etc. Intentional interference with or hindering or obstruction of an investigation. Here's the funny thing, when the auditors come around once a year, the auditors are coming and we know they're going to check a certain sample because we send out samples in advance, we're clever like that. So what we do is we pre-audit those things and we make sure, just sign here, backdate here, this hasn't been signed, sign it off quickly. Ladies and gentlemen, that's an irregularity. You are manipulating the truth. It's something as simple as that. We don't consider it to be manipulation of the truth, but that's exactly what we're doing. And that then talks to the ethics of the organization. Do we think that it's fine to do those things? How many of us have driven faster than the speed limit? Sometimes that unethical behavior, conflicts of interest, we don't actually see it as quite so unethical when it's a white lie. But trust me, it is. And where do we draw the line? And then obviously corruption. And corruption is agreeing to give or agreeing to accept or actually giving or accepting some form of compensation to manipulate a process, bribery. I will give you something and you will give me the tender. And it doesn't have to be financial. Very often what happens as a consultant, if you've been a consultant with a particular client, I've got a client that I've been working with since 2007. The lines of professionalism and what is acceptable and unacceptable conduct often becomes blurry after a long-term relationship like that. Fortunately, they don't install carpets, or else I would have used them at home. But it's a simple thing like that. Oh, I heard that you're installing new carpets in your house. Let me give you a discount on it. I'll come and do it for you because we've been a service provider for so long. It's little things like that that can be considered bribery. Now, why I'm sketching this for you is that when you do your fraud risk assessments, we need to have a common understanding of what we mean by fraud. And not just the legalistic term that I went through in the first place, but the broad understanding that when we speak about fraud, let's include theft, corruption, conflicts of interest. So else you're going to have a fraud prevention plan, a theft prevention plan, let's use the umbrella phase. But in every organization, we tailor it and let's have a common understanding. To make it simple, what does it look like? Because very often you have to go back and tell your people about fraud, theft, corruption, and you lose people in the jargon. So let's make it simple. Let's give you examples. What does it look like for the organization? So we have systems issues where a process or system exists which is prone to abuse and manipulation. We have equipment and resource issues, which is the abuse of our equipment and resources. Financial issues, which is where people irregularly obtain money from the institution, and other issues. Okay, so let me take you back a few slides and look at the categories. When someone says, what does fraud look like in this institution? Fraud looks like fraudulent or irregular claim submissions. Fraud looks like theft, mismanagement, and misuse of resources for this institution and many other higher education institutions. Fraud looks like deliberate misinformation and miscommunication to the students. It looks like the manipulation of system data, conflicts of interest, plagiarism, irregular procurement practices, and abuse of leave. I'd like to see if this is updated, that we also have some focus on ethics. Because it does come in, but it comes in a lot lower. So there should be a focus on ethics. So if I say to you, assessment fraud, that's a system issue. There's an assessment system in place, and we manipulate the system. Assessment fraud. If we speak about fraudulent or irregular claim submission, financial fraud, where people have irregularly obtained money from the institution. We speak about other issues, our conflicts of interest. That's where lecturers, that's where educators have a particular interest in a contract. Irregular HR and recruitment and appointment practices. So this says to you, what does fraud look like outside of the fancy terminology? Let's break it down to the nuts and bolts. So if we were to very quickly look at a model for it, and it skipped my model page, but anyway, how do we go about identifying our fraud risks? So the first thing I'll tell you is that we all know fraud risks exist in our organization. We all have a very good idea of what it looks like. There's various pieces of information around fraud. So the first thing we'll see is if we were to go to HR, labor relations, and say to them, can I have a list of all your disciplinary proceedings that you've had in the last 12 months? If you look at why people were charged, you often find fraud risks. So our first step is to obtain fraud risk information. Look for the sources of existing fraud risk information. So we'll start off with our strategic fraud risk registers or our operational fraud risk registers, there is fraud on those registers if you just apply the fraud brain. If you apply the fraud brain and you add the words around deliberate, intent, misappropriation, think like a criminal, start putting your feet, find that. So you'll find it in internal audit reports. You know, internal audit reports often come up with there was non-compliance to a policy. But if you look at that non-compliance, have you asked yourself, considered whether it was deliberate? Was there any intent in that? So look at your internal audit reports, look at your external audit reports, look at your existing risk registers, look at your disciplinary proceedings. That's where you'll find your existing fraud risk information. That's step one. Step two in this whole process, and very often, you know, people advocate having workshops, etc., etc. We don't have the time of day to give 8 hours all the time to sit in a workshop. Very often in a fraud risk assessment process, you find more valuable information in one-on-one sessions. People are often afraid to speak out in an open forum like this. If I were to say to you, if this was all colleagues, where do you... What are your concerns around fraud, etc.? Very often people are afraid to speak out in forums like this. So one-on-one sessions work where we get down to the nuts and bolts of fraud and be very careful that it's not complaining, that it's not griping. So that's why I go back to your definition. We want to see intent, unlawfulness, the deliberateness about the actions, the misappropriation, the prejudice. You want to see those elements coming through. The next thing, step 3, once we've identified these risks, we identify, we confirm, and we assess. Now, I'm sure that everyone over the last few hours, we've gone through impact and likelihood. What is the impact if this fraud were to occur? What is the likelihood if this fraud were to occur? If you look at something like procurement fraud, if you're a procurement-heavy organization, the impact is higher, the likelihood is higher, because we do so much procurement. In an institution like this, what would be the impact of assessment fraud and how likely is it that we will have assessment fraud? Consider the quantum of students that come through here for assessment. It's very likely and the impact is very high. Let's not beat around the bush, it's very likely. So at PwC, I wouldn't necessarily have assessment fraud because I don't assess students. But this is the core, one of your core functions in this organization and something that must be red flagged and tracked. So we confirm an impact and likelihood. And again, I always say to people, be careful of assigning a material value to an incident of fraud. Because you might say to me that it was only 10,000 Rand that was stolen. But it's not a value, it's the principle, because how many other 10,000s were stolen. So be careful of giving it a financial weighting, and be careful of materiality. I once worked on the audit of a big bank from the forensic side, and massive bank. And for me, from forensics, any fraud, anything unusual, doesn't matter what it is, must be investigated. That bank had a materiality level of 50 million Rand. Any unreconciled item or any suspicious transaction, 50 million or below, is not worth tracking. But that's from an audit perspective. So that's what I'm saying. Don't assign material values to it. The next thing is, how do we respond to this fraud? Now we've got these wonderful fraud risks. And again, in an ideal world where we have unlimited resources, unlimited time, unlimited money, etc., we can put in endless and wonderful controls. The fact is we don't. Limited resources, limited time, limited budget. We prioritize our fraud risks and focus on perhaps the top 5 fraud risks that we can do something about. That's our operational response. How do we respond operationally? We put certain controls in place. That's our response. Very important for me is the last step. Step number 5 is your strategic response. We treat fraud operationally. Very often, fraud doesn't even hit our audit committees. It doesn't even hit executive management. What we need to do is start elevating the fight against fraud to a governance level. It has to hit the radar of executive management and not, oh yes, we had an incident of fraud, so we lost money. How do we respond strategically as an organization, and what's our strategic response? This is where I recommend that we put together the strategic or your anti-fraud framework. That's your umbrella document, your governing document that says, as us as an organization, how do we respond from a strategic perspective to fraud? Not only after it's happened, and I have this thing that I call, it's a PDIR strategy, your prevention, detection, investigation, and remediation strategy for any organization. And that's a strategy document. That's elevating your fight against fraud to a strategic level. So in a nutshell, ladies and gentlemen, if I can summarize it, it's very integrated. Fraud is very integrated to the fraud risks we've identified. We need to understand where we are exposed to fraud. We need to have a clear handle on those fraud risks. We need to know what we are doing about those fraud risks, or if we are doing about those fraud risks. Because guaranteed, if fraud does happen, the impact, that loss of that $100 million to the organization, doesn't only impact that we lost the money, it has far-reaching consequences, as clearly demonstrated by incidents of fees must fall, etc. So get a handle on your fraud, be proactive about managing it, go out there and identify your fraud risks. And that's my 30 minutes on the dot. Thank you. Thank you very much.